Hi, Y12. Right, second two stanzas on Litany now. So we begin just at the tail end of the second stanza. So the engagement rings on the hand are poised, so something's about to happen, and it's an embarrassing word, broken to bits, which tents the air like an accident. I'm just going to read to the end of this stanza. This was the code I learnt at my mother's knee, pretending to read, where no one had cancer or sex or debts, and certainly not leukemia, which no one could spell. The year a mass grave of wasps bobbed in a jam jar. A butterfly stammered itself in my curious hands. In fact, I'm just going to read to the end. A boy in the playground, I said, told me to fuck off, and a thrilled, malicious pause salted my tongue like an imminent storm. Then uproar. I'm sorry, Mrs. Barr, Mrs. Hunt, Mrs. Emery, sorry, Mrs. Rain. Yes, I can summon their names. My mother's mute shame, the taste of soap. So, clearly the embarrassing word is fuck. The child said fuck and then they repeat it later on. And this word breaks something. An embarrassing word, broken to bits. And broken is emphasised there with enjambment, emphasised pretty significantly. As I'm sure you remember from GCSE, enjambment is significant at any point potentially, but if you have it breaking across a stanza, there's added significance. So if you have enjambment at the end of a stanza, you always want to look at it. So it is broken. Again, I'm going to have to just move down here. So enjambment, we've got a bit of level 6 here. And the embarrassing word, broken to bits, suggests to me the image that we had earlier of quite a tense, in a way, tense atmosphere, perhaps linking into this idea of Pyrex, which I'm going to let you look at. The atmosphere is quite tense, the atmosphere crackles, and therefore the atmosphere can be broken very easily with one word. So it suggests a tense atmosphere. And it suggests that the persona can, they feel tense in that environment because it's not their peer group, it's their mother's peer group. So the persona feels that tension, they feel out of place. So the word breaks something, broken to bits, which tents the air like an accident. Now I'm going to pick up this simile here, not particularly to talk about this simile, but to talk about the use of similes in general. So we've had a few. We've had the hard as the bright stones in engagement rings, and we've also had like a rumour. And I think, do we have another one further down? No, we don't. We've got 3 in total. So it's quite a lot of similes for quite a short poem. And the point that I want to make is that similes, and I think we looked at this when we were looking at one of the Paris texts. I think the Not for Children, remember the, oh no, Not for Parents ones, all the really colourful graphological ones from the guidebook. We talked about how things either aimed at children or written or spoken by children are often quite heavy in simile because it's a way of explaining things that they perhaps don't quite understand and relating it back to something that they do understand. So I think this and the other use of similes tells us about this childish poetic voice as an AO2 point. So we have this childish poetic voice, we know it's a memory from childhood, and they are frequently having to compare this kind of uncomfortable, strange adult world with things that they do understand. So they would understand that an accident, somebody getting hurt, would cause tension. They don't quite understand why saying this word would cause tension, so they link the two to help them understand it. So they go on to say, this was the code I learnt at my mother's knee, pretending to read. So I'm interested in the use of the word code here, and I'm also interested in the use of the verb pretending. So the child, the persona, learns a code. And they learn that while they were pretending. So I said right at the start that this poem straddles a couple of themes. It talks about memory and it talks about childhood, but also starts to talk about language and the power that language has. So language can break something. And also for a child, language and conversation can seem to be in code. So code here acts as a metaphor. And it just tells us that the poetic voice doesn't really understand the way that adult conversation works. They have to decode it, and it is as complex as a code. And that could be adult conversation in general. We would understand why a child would be a bit confused by lots of things that adults say because they don't understand the context or they don't understand the vocabulary. But particularly within this context, we've said that everything seems quite restricted. They have a very restricted conversation. They just talk about this, and it's repetitive. They talk about the things that they're going to buy, and everything else is restricted and suggests that behind one another's back they gossip. So language is restricted within this context, and it's also difficult for a child to understand. So adult language is confusing, and that's why it is metaphorically a code, and the child has to learn this code. So I'm going to put that in blue because although I don't really have time don't have space, to write it out, it is a comment on the poetic voice and the way that they see adult conversations. So they learn this code, they learn that certain words are bad and that certain words cause a lot of tension. They learn that difficulty of adult language while they're at their mother's knee pretending to read. So I'm going to take the context of being at the mother's knee to be at one of these little catalogue parties. So the adults are having a catalogue party, the child is there, perhaps they're too young to be left on their own, and they're looking at the catalogue, but they're only pretending to read. Now, I think two things about this. Perhaps that could be a kind of optional thing you explore. I've got a couple of other ones that I definitely want you to, but perhaps you could think about this as well. Why would the child be pretending to read? Well, either, to me, that suggests the isolation of the child because they can't read what's in the catalogue. So they're trying to appear adult and mature by looking at it, but they don't understand the words, so it's just a pretense. Or it could be that they're capable of reading it, but they're more interested in listening into the conversation, trying to work out the code of the adult conversation. So they pretend to be doing something innocuous and permissible, but they're actually kind of earwigging on the conversation. So either they're isolated or they're trying to understand that adult world. And the next little bit talks about, again, a little bit like up here in the parenthesis where they talk about the types of thing in the catalogue that the women are discussing. This is the type of conversation the women also had. So at the mother's knee, the child would listen in, and in this type of conversation between these very image conscious, socially conscious women, they wouldn't talk about any real important matters. So no one had cancer, they wouldn't talk about the reality of perhaps friends or family members being unwell. They would not talk about sex, that would be a taboo subject. They wouldn't talk about money, that would be taboo. Certainly not leukemia, which no one could spell, so another reference to death there. So this conversation is very restricted, and I would pick up on the repetition here of or and. So repeating those conjunctions. Got some level 2 there, repetition of conjunctions. Serves just to emphasise the full restriction of the conversation. They don't talk about this or this or this, and they certainly don't talk about that. So emphasises the linguistic restriction that these women have. And next thing I want you to comment on is this phrase, which no one could spell. Why does the poetic voice include that? Why do they include the fact that none of these women could spell leukemia? Why is that worth commenting on? Do you think that comes from the poetic voice as a child or the poetic voice as an adult, and why would it be included? And then they kind of step back a little bit from the context, and they talk about the context of this childhood memory within that year of their life. And they say it's the year a mass grave of wasps bobbed in a jam jar, and a butterfly stammered itself in my curious hands. So I want you to think about this. A mass grave of wasps. Why is that a memory that the persona is picking out from that year of their life? What do you think is significant about this reference to death? And I'm going to think about the child's curious hands. So this is where I think we have the most clear link back to Stafford Afternoons. The idea of childhood memory being about trying to understand the adult world and trying to make a move into the next phase of life. So Stafford Afternoons link, and that's about wanting to kind of mature and develop and understand more about the world. Albeit in this one they do it in a safer environment, it's in the lounge of their parents rather than out in this wooded area, metaphorically the adult world. And then on to the final stanza now. It's quite reminiscent here, I think, again of Stafford Afternoons. A boy in the playground, I said, told me to fuck off. And a thrilled, malicious pause salted my tongue like an imminent storm. So a little bit like, in Stafford Afternoons, one of the things you talked about was the boy throwing a stone. We have another reference to an anonymous boy, a boy in the playground. And I think that is significant. So it could be that this is actually true. A boy in the playground did tell the poetic voice to fuck off. Or that could be a kind of a cipher. And a cipher is like a kind of placeholder, a generic symbol of something. So it could be that this is just symbolic of other children, or kind of playground language when the children are getting a bit older and they're trying to impress one another. So the boy in the playground as a noun phrase could be specific, or it could be symbolic of children in general. I'm going to go with symbolic of kind of childhood and children. And we might question whether it's significant that once again it's a boy. So there is a representation of masculinity here, which is taboo and kind of threatening in a way. I suppose it's relatively threatening to be told to fuck off, so we can say it's threatening. So the persona uses direct speech here. I'll add that as well. And the use of direct speech just gives a freedom to what they're saying. And that freedom, I'm just going to check this is still on the recording, it's not gone off the bottom. No, it hasn't. That idea of freedom could be contrasted to the lack of freedom that these women are experiencing. So it makes the persona seem very different. The childhood world of the persona very different to the restrictive adult world of the parents. So very different to restrictive adult world. Put that in blue. And we know that this, that breaking this tension and embarrassing the parent is something that the child really enjoyed doing, because there's a thrilled, malicious pause. So thrilled and malicious, those adjectives referring to the joy that the poetic voice felt from rebelling in that way. So adjectives. The idea of being a rebel is something that the poetic voice really savours and really enjoys. And that's understandable. It's something that's common with representations of childhood, that particularly as one gets closer to adulthood, one wants to push the boundaries of childhood and to attempt to verge into adulthood. So they're trying to rebel, and not just rebel, but it's malicious. There's an intent to hurt. And that suggests something slightly different about the relationship between the mother and the child, that they are frustrated. They want to embarrass the mother. And it says that the thrilled malicious pause salted my tongue like an imminent storm. That's the final bit I want you to think about. This simile, oh, so we do have another simile. This simile, like an imminent storm, what is that doing there? You tell me what you think. And then uproar. So we've got a minor sentence kind of building a climax here. I'm sorry, Mrs. Barr, Mrs. Hunt, Mrs. Emery, sorry, Mrs. Rain. And we have the direct speech of the persona being mirrored in the direct speech of the adult as well. So very specific memory here, coming back with the exact words. Yes, I can summon their names, my mother's mute shame, the taste of soap. So clearly the punishment, I don't know if you're aware of this, but that was a kind of common punishment for swearing or using foul language, is having your mouth washed out with soap. I remember my granny doing it to me once. I don't remember what I did or what I said, but I had to put soap in my mouth and kind of swill it round with water. So that's the punishment that this child has for swearing. And I'm going to finish by thinking about the summoning and the mother's mute shame. So I can summon their names is a very deliberate verb choice. Now it suggests, this is coming from the perspective of the persona as an adult now. So we've got adult perspective. And there's a slight tonal shift I feel here with the verb summon, because that suggests now, I think, a shame in this memory. To summon something back means to recall, but not to recall in a light-hearted way, to have to kind of dredge something back up. So I think the adult perspective is one of shame. Perhaps now they are older, they can sympathise with the parental perspective. Perhaps their behaviour after this became worse and they're reflecting on that shame. But there's definitely a shift in the tone here. I'll just put that in as well. I don't think it's enough to create a volta, but I think it's subtle. And I'm going to end on this. My mother's mute shame. So, noun phrase of mute shame. And I think that's a significant significant phrase to use at the end of the poem, because we've talked about the significance of language, and language being something which is codified and therefore difficult to understand. Language which is something which happens slyly and quietly. Language is something which is restricted to a certain semantic field or topic. And here, right at the end, it becomes mute. So there's a progression, I think, in the poem of language being stopped altogether. And language, therefore, has to represent freedom. Remember, we talked about the direct speech of the child representing the freedom of the use of language, and how in this adult world that could break something. Well, if language is stopped, then language is freedom. And that's quite a harsh comment on the life of the persona's mother, the life of adults in general. And a very fitting end to a poem which talks about, from its title, language being repetitive and tedious, but also certain words being sacred. And if the world of these catalogues and consumerism is sacred, then fuck has got to be blasphemous. And we're going to end on that point. So I'm just going to highlight that word there. I'm going to do a little code here. And if we take the title, this is blasphemy. So blasphemy is speaking against God and against the sacred nature of these catalogue meetings. Okay, and that's Litany.